My dad had this opportunity to buy this Chevrolet dealership in Sault Ste. Marie and took that opportunity. And so as a family, we moved to the Sioux in 1967. We moved there when I was in the 5th grade. And growing up, it was a tough time for me. A lot of kids were in hockey. I was not a sports person myself. Really, the problem for me was I was bullied a lot as a student. And that bullying started in elementary school, went on to junior high, and all the way through high school, all 4 years of high school. I would pay kids off with lunch money because I didn't want to get beat up on the way home from school. And so I quickly learned there were different routes home. You know, I think it's the case that I was probably one of those kids or students that just didn't fit in. I was different. And I don't know exactly why that happened, what made me different, what made me a target. But I think it's once you get picked as a target, I think oftentimes it just continues onward from there. And so you're just, once one person starts, then it just you become a target. I got beat up, knocked to the ground a few times. But for me, the harder part for me was the emotional side of the bullying, not the physical side. I just had a really low feeling of self-worth. Self-esteem suffered greatly. I don't think even I realized it at the time, how much I did. But it wasn't until many, many years later that I realized that the toll this took on me. I kind of just took upon it that this was just the way it was going to be and the way it was. I didn't know any different. I can remember in junior high, we were friends with a junior high English teacher and did a lot of stuff with her. And one time I mentioned the bullying to her. And it was more of an offhanded comment, if I remember right at the time. It wasn't anything I was complaining. And the next day, I can remember being paged to principal's office. And I can picture it so well, even though it happened so many years ago. And I went down to the office, and the principal at the time asked me, about the bullying, and I told everything. And it wasn't long, I think a day or two later, that I realized I'd made a terrible mistake by speaking up. And so I never spoke up again. On the way home that day, after going home, that was the more physical part of the bullying, of the being knocked down. Because I didn't even think about it at the time, but they were probably approached by the principal. It didn't take a person long to realize it, who told. And so I just apologized for it, moved on, and just took a different route home next time. At that time, the internet was not a place that you researched for information, so you'd go to books. And I can remember you'd go to books and say, okay, what would be a way to commit suicide? Because I did not want to grow up this way this way the rest of my life. I really wish now that somebody a fellow student would have come alongside me and said, "You're okay." About a year ago, I went on the internet and did a Google search for the person the chief instigator of the bullying. And as I saw his name, it was an unusual name, so it was easy to recognize it. I know I have the right person. And his son was put in jail many times for domestic violence. And so his father, which is the one that bullied me, carried it on to his children. So I think it's that succession of bullying that carries on from generation to generation. Be an interesting one to watch. I had an opportunity to go back to the Center for Creative Leadership. It was in Colorado Springs, just a beautiful setting. And the beautiful building started on a Monday and went through a Friday. They watched us interact with each other on a group setting. They did a lot of personality Myers-Briggs testing, profiling. And at the end of the week, they met with us on a one-on-one basis. And it was a psychologist that met with us, met with me. And as he sat down, just he and I, and he says, I see some things in your week-long profile here that trouble me to a certain degree. And I can't remember his exact words, but he says, what I do remember is, he says, I think you could benefit from mental health treatment. I says, what do you mean by this? I mean, mental health, what are you talking about? And he says, well, I see some type of PTSD in your back, post-traumatic stress disorder. Were you ever in the military? I said, no, but as we started visiting about this some more, he suggested, I said, what would this mental health treatment? And he says, I'm a psychologist, but he says, you need more in-depth treatment than I can give you today. And he says, I think it could be worthy of this. So I says, okay, I'll take that. I'm gonna do something about that. went back to work on a Monday. I was at the time and am now on the board of Asante. And so I called Roy Vineyard, who's the CEO of Asante, and said, I'm really embarrassed to say this, but it was suggested I get mental health treatment. And he was totally supportive. I didn't think about that for a couple days. And so the next day he called me back and he says, I've got you, he says, here's the number I want you to call. And it was the person at behavioral health unit for Dr. Phillips, Dr. Richard Phillips, and he's a psychiatrist. And he says, I called Dr. Phillips and I set up an appointment for a few days later and I went down and saw him. And that was like the beginning of this road of help for me. We met over about once a week for a few months, and he worked miracles with me. He just totally worked miracles with me in terms of seeing where I could change my life. And he didn't do it with medication. He did it with listening. And he did it with some action items. So that's the reason I decided to go on this public thing, but I was scared to death. Because I'm in business, and I did not want people to think that this person, because he had sought out mental health help, that there was something flawed about him, there was something wrong about him. In our country today, if we have a heart condition, we go to a cardiologist. That's okay to talk about. If we have cancer and we go to an oncologist. But if you say you went and saw a psychiatrist because you're seeking mental health treatment, to me, my impression was people look down upon people that talk about that. And mental health is something that we don't want to talk about in society today, and we should have that conversation. You know, I volunteer quite regularly, and I just did on last Thursday at the Oregon Youth Authority at the prison, and I've done that for about the past 7 years. And these are students that obviously have committed crimes, some terrible, terrible crimes. And to let them know, I tell my bullying story, because a lot of people, they see me as this successful person in the community and is very involved and would say he's got it made. But at the same time, there's so much in my past that was not that way. One of the things I really enjoy doing now, and it's the most beneficial part of my week, is I go down to 2 North now, which is a behavioral health unit. And I was on this an outpatient basis when I was going to see Dr. Phillips. But now I see patients weekly with Bonnie or Molly as therapy dogs. And it is absolutely the highest part of my week when I go down there on an afternoon and I visit with the patients at the behavioral health unit and I see the progress that they make. And I don't know how you define success for a person. And am I happy now? Yes, I am. But I wasn't happy all my life. There's a stigma of reaching out for help on mental health. And you're afraid that somebody else is going to think less of you as a person for reaching out for mental health help. When in fact, to me, you're the bravest person on the planet when you can come forward and say, hey, I need help. I still talk to Dr. Phillips, saw him at a dinner a couple weeks ago. And, I told him how he changed a life. And so that's the reason I am willing to go on camera and talk about this thing, even though you can tell it's a tough thing to talk about. And part of it is tears of sadness, but more importantly, is tears of joy.